The first thing I saw that morning wasn't the sunrise over my pasture or the old maple tree my late father planted 40 years ago. It was a brand new steel chain stretched across the gravel lane that had served my family for decades, and hanging from it like some kind of trophy was a shiny padlock that still had the hardware store sticker on it. 20 yards away stood my new neighbor, Calvin Mercer, coffee mug in one hand, the other stuffed into his pocket, wearing the kind of smile people wear when they think they've already won. He didn't wave, didn't even pretend to be friendly. Instead, he raised his voice so everyone watering their lawns could hear him. "That lane runs through my side now, Owen. Find yourself another way out." I looked at the lock, then at him, then at my truck idling on the gravel, and for a long moment neither of us said another word. The funny thing about getting older is that you stop confusing silence with weakness. At 25, I probably would have jumped out, started yelling, maybe even grabbed a pair of bolt cutters from the barn. At 64, I just put the truck in reverse, drove back toward my garage, and let him think it scared me. Sometimes the best answer is the one that makes the other guy wonder why you didn't answer at all. My name is Owen Carter, and my family has lived outside Willow Ridge longer than half the houses on this road have existed. My father built our place with 2 friends and an old tractor back in the 70s, before developers discovered this county and started carving horse fields into subdivisions with fancy names and decorative stone entrances. We weren't rich people. We fixed what broke, sharpened what got dull, and believed a handshake meant something. That gravel lane behind my fence wasn't just a shortcut. It connected my equipment shed, my back pasture, and the county road beyond the creek. I hauled hay through it, tractors through it, trailers through it, and more memories than I could count. When my daughter learned to drive, that was the first lane she practiced on because there wasn't enough traffic to scare her. When my wife was still alive, she'd wave at me from the porch every Saturday morning as I rattled down that same stretch of gravel heading to town for feed and coffee. So no, it wasn't just dirt and rocks to me. It was part of the rhythm of my life. Calvin moved in about 2 years before all this happened. At first, everyone liked him. He grilled burgers for the neighborhood on Memorial Day, complimented people's gardens, and shook hands like a politician during election season. He'd say things like, "I'm just happy to be part of a real community." Folks ate that up. Even I thought maybe we'd become friends. I loaned him a post-hole digger once, and he brought it back clean, which around here is almost a sign of sainthood. But little by little the cracks started showing. First, he complained that my pickup left tire marks near the edge of his fence after heavy rain. Then he said my trailer was making too much dust. Then he asked if I could stop driving before 7 in the morning because it disturbed his remote work meetings. I apologized more than I needed to because I figured neighbors should try to get along. Still, every time I gave an inch, Calvin seemed determined to measure another foot. My friend Earl, who runs the feed store, warned me over coffee one morning. "That guy doesn't want peace, Owen. He wants control." I laughed it off because that's what decent people do when they don't want trouble. Trouble, unfortunately, doesn't need your invitation. About 3 months before the chain appeared, a certified letter landed in my mailbox. It claimed that the gravel lane crossed property belonging to Calvin according to his deed and demanded I stop using it immediately. The wording sounded less like a neighbor and more like someone who had copied paragraphs from the internet after midnight. Most people would have fired off an angry response. I didn't. I pulled an old metal box from my basement shelf, the one my father always called the family memory vault. Inside were faded surveys, tax records, yellowing maps, and handwritten notes from county meetings held before disco music existed. My wife used to tease me for keeping all that paper. One day, she'd say, "You're going to save the world with a file cabinet." I smiled, remembering that as I spread everything across my kitchen table. The coffee grew cold while daylight turned into evening, and the more I looked, the less worried I became. There were details Calvin had either missed or ignored, little markings and references that didn't make much sense to someone skimming documents, but meant everything if you knew county land records. Instead of calling him, I called the county archives office. The woman who answered sounded like she'd been there since typewriters ruled the earth. She listened quietly while I read parcel numbers and old filing references. Then she paused and said, "Mr. Carter, that's interesting. You might want copies of the original access maps from 1970. They tell a different story." I thanked her and drove down the next morning. She slid a thick folder across the counter with a smile that reminded me of school librarians who secretly enjoy watching mysteries unfold. "Take your time," she said. I did. Every page I turned felt like another piece of a puzzle Calvin didn't even know existed. Meanwhile, he seemed more confident by the day. He waved at neighbors while I noticed conversation stop when I walked by. One afternoon, my mailbox held another surprise. Not from Calvin this time, but from a neighborhood association newsletter mentioning ongoing property boundary improvements without naming anyone. Funny how rumors travel faster than facts in small communities. Then came the post that really told me what kind of game he was playing. On the neighborhood app, Calvin uploaded a picture of the locked gate with the caption, "Finally resolved a long-standing encroachment issue." Sometimes you have to stand up for your property rights. Within an hour, people were clicking thumbs-up emojis and writing comments like "good for you" and "about time." Not one person asked what my side of the story might be. I stared at that screen for a minute, chuckled to myself, set the phone down, and walked out to feed my horses. Earl happened to stop by that evening and asked if I was going to answer Calvin online. I tossed another flake of hay into the pen and said nope. He frowned. "Then what are you going to do?" I watched the horses settle, brushed the dust from my jeans, and smiled the same way my father used to whenever someone underestimated him. "I'm going to let paperwork do the talking, Earl." And paperwork never loses its temper. The next week looked ordinary to everyone else. But to me, it felt like sitting on a porch while a thunderstorm gathered over the hills, because I already knew lightning was coming. I just didn't know exactly where it would strike. Calvin, on the other hand, acted like a man celebrating a victory parade. Every morning, his SUV sat proudly at the end of his driveway while he watered flowers that hadn't needed watering in days, glancing toward my place just long enough to make sure I noticed him. Sometimes he'd lift his coffee cup in a fake little salute. I returned the favor by pretending he wasn't there. That probably irritated him more than an argument ever could. Around town, people started asking careful questions without really asking them. The cashier at Miller's Grocery said, "Heard you've got some property issues." The barber smiled through the mirror and said, "These new folks sure love lawyers." Even Pastor Dan, who had baptized both my children, mentioned after Sunday service that neighbors should always seek peace before conflict. I nodded politely because there wasn't much point trying to explain a chess game to people who thought they were watching checkers. Meanwhile, I made another trip to the county records office, where the same woman, whose name I finally learned was Linda, had stacked several oversized maps on a table. She unfolded one after another with the care of someone handling family photographs. The oldest was dated more than 50 years earlier. Thick pencil lines traced parcel boundaries, faded stamps covered one corner, and near the gravel lane sat a notation that made me lean closer. Linda tapped it with her finger. "Most people never read these attachments," she said quietly. "They only read the deed summary." I looked up, and that's where people get into trouble. She smiled. "Sometimes they buy land. Sometimes they buy assumptions." That sentence stayed with me the whole drive home. My father had always believed that the truth was usually hidden in the pages nobody wanted to read. As a kid, I thought that was just another one of his country sayings, like never trust a fence built in the rain or never borrow a chainsaw from a man who smiles too much. Now I realized he had been talking about people as much as property. That evening, my daughter Emily called from Ohio. She could hear something in my voice before I even told her the story. "Dad, please don't do anything stubborn." I laughed. "You've been saying that since you were 16. She laughed too, then grew serious. "Mom would have told you to stay calm. Your mother also would have baked cookies for the entire neighborhood while quietly collecting evidence against the loudest one." Emily sighed. "That's true." We spent another half hour talking about family and grandchildren, but after hanging up, I sat alone on the porch thinking about my wife. She hated unnecessary fights, yet she hated bullies even more. More than once, I'd watched her smile kindly at someone who underestimated her until the exact second she calmly proved them wrong. Somehow, remembering her made me even more patient. 2 days later, I received copies of every relevant filing I had requested, and buried among those papers was the detail Calvin had apparently skipped over when he signed his closing documents. The gravel lane was classified decades ago as a shared private access corridor benefiting multiple parcels, with usage rights attached to the land itself rather than the individual owners. That meant nobody could simply wake up one morning by the neighboring property and decide to play king of the road. But that wasn't even the interesting part. The interesting part was what appeared on another map showing roadway connections. Calvin's paved driveway, the one he used every single day without thinking twice, crossed a narrow strip in front of my parcel before joining the public road. The previous owners had always used it without conflict because everyone understood the arrangement. The problem was that understanding and legal recording are two different things. I drove over to see my old friend Harold Simmons, a retired surveyor who knew county land history better than anyone alive. His workshop smelled like cedar and machine oil, and maps covered one wall. After studying the copies for almost 20 minutes, he leaned back and whistled. "Well, I'll be. That's good or bad?" I asked. "Depends who you are." He pointed at Calvin's driveway. "If this is accurate, he's relying on access that's never been formally recorded as an easement. He's been using it because nobody objected. And if somebody did," Harold looked over his glasses, "then the county would probably require the issue to be resolved before pretending it doesn't exist anymore." I didn't celebrate. In fact, I felt strangely disappointed. Part of me wished the answer had been simpler. I would have preferred a conversation over coffee ending with a handshake. But Calvin had chosen public humiliation over private discussion. And once lawyers and county records enter a neighborhood dispute, emotions quickly become expensive. Earl visited again that weekend carrying 2 sandwiches because he knew I rarely stopped working long enough to eat lunch. We sat on overturned buckets inside the equipment shed while I explained what I had found. He listened without interrupting until I finished. Then he asked, "So what's the plan?" I shrugged. "The truth." He stared at me. "That's your whole strategy?" "Pretty much." Earl laughed so hard he nearly dropped his sandwich. "Only you would call the truth a strategy." Maybe he was right. On Monday morning, I filed documentation requesting the county review the access classifications connected to the affected parcels. No dramatic speeches, no threats, just forms, signatures, copies, and patience. Calvin apparently had no idea any of this was happening because that afternoon he uploaded another neighborhood post showing himself beside the locked chain. Someone commented, "Guess he finally got the message." Calvin replied with a laughing emoji. Looking back now, that tiny little emoji cost him more than any lawyer ever did. A week passed before the county inspector arrived. I happened to be repairing a fence when a white pickup rolled onto my property. A man stepped out carrying a clipboard and introduced himself. We walked the lane together while he measured distances, examined markers, compared parcel references, and took photographs. He asked very few questions, which somehow made him seem even more serious. At one point, Calvin noticed us and marched over wearing the confident expression of someone expecting applause. "Glad you're here," he announced before the inspector could even speak. "I've been trying to stop unauthorized use of my land." The inspector looked at his notes. "We'll determine that after reviewing the recorded documents." Calvin folded his arms. "The deed is perfectly clear." The inspector didn't argue. He simply said, "Sometimes deeds are summaries of larger recorded instruments." I almost smiled but kept my face straight. Calvin looked confused for the first time since this whole mess began. He glanced at me as if expecting some sarcastic comment. I gave him nothing. Silence again. It had become my favorite language. 3 afternoons later, a certified envelope appeared in Calvin's mailbox, and another arrived at mine. I watched from my porch as he opened his copy. Even from a distance, I saw his shoulders stiffen. He read the first page, flipped to the second, then back again. His confident posture disappeared. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Earl. "You reading yours?" he asked. "Just started." "Tell me I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing." I read slowly, line by line. The county confirmed that the gravel lane functioned as a protected shared private access corridor, and that obstructing it violated the recorded usage rights attached to multiple parcels. Furthermore, because questions regarding adjoining access have been raised during the review, the county had identified that the existing connection used by Calvin's property to reach the public roadway lacked a formally recorded easement and required legal resolution within 30 days. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. Earl finally broke the silence. "Well," I answered quietly, "looks like the only road he tried to close just opened a much bigger one." At almost that exact moment, I saw Calvin leave his house carrying the letter in one hand and marching straight toward my fence with a speed that told me this story was far from over. Calvin reached my fence so fast that he was out of breath before he even started talking. And for a second, I almost felt sorry for him because the confidence that had carried him through the past few weeks had vanished, replaced by the kind of panic people where when they suddenly realize the rules apply to them too. He waved the county letter in the air and said, "You did this." I leaned against the fence post and answered, "No, Calvin, the county did this. I just asked them to read their own records." His face turned red. "You knew about this the whole time." I nodded. I knew enough to ask questions. He took a step closer. "You could have talked to me." That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable. "Talk to you? You locked my gate, posted about me online, and let half the neighborhood think I was stealing your land." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There wasn't much left to say. For the first time since he moved in, he wasn't speaking from a position of power, but from a position of consequences. The following morning, a county inspector returned with a maintenance crew. Several neighbors wandered outside, pretending to check their mail, while secretly watching every move. Mrs. Dalton from across the street stood with her garden hose running into the grass for nearly 10 minutes because she was too busy staring to notice. The inspector walked directly to the chain, examined the paperwork one final time, then instructed the crew to remove the lock. It took less than 30 seconds. That shiny padlock, the one Calvin had proudly displayed like a trophy, landed in the back of a county truck with a dull metallic thud that somehow sounded louder than any argument we could have had. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. Real life rarely gives you dramatic applause. Instead, there was only silence and the crunch of boots on gravel. Calvin stood on his driveway with his hands on his hips, watching the entire scene unfold. A week earlier, he had looked like a man defending his kingdom. Now he looked like someone discovering that castles built on assumptions have weak foundations. Later that afternoon, I noticed his neighborhood post had disappeared. Every congratulatory comment was gone along with it. Funny thing about the internet, people rush to celebrate accusations, but almost never gather with the same enthusiasm for corrections. Earl drove over around sunset, carrying 2 coffees, and parked beside my barn. He handed me one without saying a word. We sat on the tailgate, looking toward the lane that had suddenly become peaceful again. Finally, he asked, "Feel like you won?" I thought about it longer than he expected. "No." He looked surprised. After everything, I shrugged. Winning would have been sitting down with a neighbor 2 years ago and solving this over coffee. This is just what happens when pride gets involved. Earl nodded slowly. "Still, he brought it on himself." "Maybe," I replied, "but now both of us have to live next door to the memory of it." Over the next month, Calvin became a different person. He stopped lingering outside whenever I drove by. The loud conversations on his porch disappeared. Contractors visited his property more than once. Survey stakes appeared and vanished. And I heard through Harold that lawyers were negotiating paperwork to formalize his access before the deadline expired. I never asked for details because at that point it wasn't my business anymore. One Saturday morning, while I was repairing an old gate behind the barn, I heard footsteps on the gravel. I turned around expecting Earl, but instead found Calvin standing there holding a small cardboard box. Without saying much, he sat on the workbench. Inside was the very same padlock that had blocked my lane. "The county said it was mine," he muttered. I looked at it and then at him. "You can keep it." He shook his head. "No, I don't think I need it anymore." There was an awkward silence that stretched between us before he quietly added, "I should have handled things differently." Those 7 words were probably the most honest thing he'd said since moving into the neighborhood. I answered probably. We never became friends after that, and honestly I don't think either of us expected to. But we learned to wave again when passing on the road, and sometimes that's enough. People often ask me why I stayed so calm when he locked my gate. The truth is simple. Anger feels powerful because it's loud, But patience is usually stronger because it gives facts time to catch up with arrogance. My father used to tell me that land remembers every footprint and paper remembers every signature. Back then, I thought he was just talking about farms. Now I know he was talking about life. You can build fences, install chains, post online, and convince an entire neighborhood that you're right, but eventually the truth shows up carrying a clipboard instead of a pitchfork. And here's the part that still divides people whenever I tell this story. Some friends insist I should have warned Calvin before involving the county, because that's what good neighbors do. Others believe he made his own bed the moment he chose public humiliation over private conversation, and that I simply let the law follow its course. So now I want to ask you the same question that keeps coming up every time this story is told. If someone deliberately blocked your property and publicly painted you as the villain, would you have confronted them immediately, or would you have stayed silent and let the paperwork speak for itself? Share your answer in the comments, because sometimes the most interesting part of a story isn't who won, it's discovering how differently people define justice.